On a pleasantly warm June afternoon, the lawns of Heathercombe Manor shimmered under the soft sunlight, trimmed to perfection for Lady Adeline Forsyth's annual garden fete. Villagers from all corners of Heathercombe-on-Wren, a place so peaceful that even scandal arrived politely, wandered among the bunting and trestle tables, nibbling seed cakes and commenting on the roses. It was, by all appearances, a blissfully uneventful day. Miss Jane Marple, quietly seated beneath a striped parasol near the hydrangeas, was content to observe the small procession of human nature as it passed her by. The vicar's wife fussed over the jam competition, 2 local boys attempted to sneak lemonade without paying, and Lady Forsyth herself flitted between guests like a dragonfly in a lavender hat. Nothing seemed amiss, which Miss Marple well knew was often when life chose to change its mind. A low hum of speculation rippled across the lawn before Miss Marple, and indeed the entire village, had time to register what they saw. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark travelling coat, disembarking from a hired motorcar. His appearance was both unexpected and strangely familiar, like a figure from an old photograph stepping abruptly into the present. Lady Forsyth gasped audibly. Several teacups rattled on saucers, and Mrs. Penworthy whispered rather too loudly, "Good heavens, is that Inspector Blithe?" Inspector Arthur Blithe, once the county's rising star in criminal investigation, had disappeared from public life without explanation nearly 7 years earlier. His cases had been the talk of newspapers, his methods admired, his sudden withdrawal the subject of relentless speculation. And yet here he was, striding across the immaculate lawn as though he had only stepped away for a moment. Lady Forsyth recovered enough to greet him, though her smile trembled at the edges. "Inspector, dear Arthur, what a surprise. We hardly knew what became of you." Blithe removed his hat, revealing flecks of silver in otherwise dark hair. His expression held the polite stiffness of a man unused to social niceties. "Lady Forsyth, I apologize for the abrupt entrance. I had business that led me back to Heathercombe." His gaze swept the guests. "I'd hoped to slip in unobtrusively. No one who knew the village could have believed that possible." Miss Marple watched him with mild curiosity. He carried himself with the same decisive manner she remembered from the trial of the Greenridge counterfeiters. Yet something in his eyes seemed dimmed, almost haunted. The fete resumed its amiable bustle, though in a more subdued tone, as villagers stole glances at Blithe. It might have remained merely a topic for gossip, had not a sharp, startled cry cut across the lawn. "Lady Forsyth, come quickly!" It was the housemaid Ellen, breathless and pale as milk. Guests turned, teacups froze mid-air. Lady Forsyth's face drained of colour. "In the West Arboretum, my lady," Ellen gasped. Someone's collapsed." Lady Forsyth hurried off, Inspector Blithe immediately behind her. Miss Marple rose as well, delicately brushing crumbs from her skirt. Years of village life had taught her that the word collapsed could mean any number of things, few of them pleasant. They found the man lying near the rose trellis, face down among the fallen petals. His clothes were fine, yet travel-worn. A satchel lay open beside him. Lady Forsyth clutched her chest. Inspector Blithe knelt and touched the man's neck. His jaw tensed. "He's dead." A collective gasp swept the onlookers. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gentle gaze settling not on the body, but on the small details. The smeared earth near the man's shoe, the odd angle of his arm, the faint scent of bitter almonds lingering in the air. "Oh dear," she murmured softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "That is most unfortunate." But in her calm blue eyes, something sharpened. This was no simple collapse, and the timing, on the very day of Inspector Blithe's mysterious return, was far too tidy for coincidence. For a moment after Inspector Blithe's words, There was only the faint rustle of leaves and the not-so-distant chime of the brass band playing an over-cheerful waltz. It seemed quite indecent that the music had continued while a man lay dead among Lady Forsyth's roses. Then, as if a spell had broken, voices began, low at first, then swelling into a rising hum. How dreadful, right in the middle of the fete. Did you see his face? I couldn't, you know. Ellen pushed me back. Who is he? A stranger, surely. Nobody from the village, I'm certain of it. Miss Marple heard these scattered remarks as clearly as if they'd been addressed to her. Long acquaintance with human nature had taught her that shock rarely silenced people for long. It simply turned talk into whispers. Lady Forsyth pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "Arthur," she said to Inspector Blithe, her voice trembling, "we can't have the guests standing about like this. Do you think we ought to send everyone home at once?" Blithe rose from his inspection of the body with measured deliberation. "Yes, I think it would be wise. The less disturbance here, the better. We'll need to inform the police, of course. Is your telephone in order?" "Yes, in the morning room." Lady Forsyth looked around vaguely, as though the room might obligingly present itself in the arboretum. Mr. Elworthy. Perhaps you would—" Mr. Elworthy, the solicitor, a thin, precise man who had the air of being permanently surprised by the world's disorder, stepped forward. "Naturally, Lady Forsyth. I shall fetch Inspector Hadley at once. They will want someone from the county." "We've an inspector already," murmured Mrs. Penworthy to Mrs. Carter, nodding meaningfully toward Blithe. "2 inspectors and a corpse. It sounds like one of those ghastly plays in town." Mrs. Carter shushed her, though she looked rather eager herself. "Do mind what you say, Mabel. The poor gentleman is not even covered. Ellen, fetch a sheet, there's a good girl." Ellen ran off, still pale, and a path was made as the guests began drifting away in uneven clusters, some obediently toward the drive, others lingering under pretext of concern, their eyes fixed greedily on the motionless figure near the roses. Miss Marple remained where she was, neither thrusting herself forward nor retreating. She watched Blithe instead. There was a certain tension about his mouth and a fixedness to his gaze which suggested that this event was not merely professional to him. He looked not simply like a man confronted with a sudden death, but as one presented with something he had been expecting in some vague, unpleasant way. Of course, one must not jump to conclusions, she reminded herself. Young Tommy Freeman had once insisted that every stranger who crossed the village green was an escaped convict. It had, in the end, only been a commercial traveler in boots. Ellen returned with a sheet, and, under Blythe's guidance, they covered the body with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. The motley crowd slowly thinned. The brass band, having been discreetly signaled by the vicar, faltered to a stop and began packing away instruments with an air of regret. Miss Marple felt a light touch on her arm. "Miss Marple, dear, you must come inside and rest." It was Mrs. Bantry, flushed and fluttering. "You ought not be standing about with all this commotion. I declare it will upset your nerves." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "my nerves are really quite all right. One may be old without being fragile in every respect, though I do think a cup of tea would be very acceptable." "Yes, well, yes." Mrs. Bantry glanced anxiously at the white-draped outline in the grass. "Let us go in, then. This is no place to be lingering, such a dreadful business." As they walked back toward the house, a little apart from the others, Miss Marple heard the swelling current of speculation eddying behind them. "Poison, did you hear? They say he just dropped—" "Could be his heart at his age. Not everyone can bear the excitement of a tombola and sponge cakes. Mark my words, it's something to do with that Blithe fellow. People don't vanish for 7 years and come back for nothing." Within half an hour, the front lawn of Heathercombe Manor was deserted, save for the gardeners and the last lingering stall-holders, stacking away crockery and folding tables with subdued efficiency. The fate's bright litter of paper cups and bunting seemed suddenly tawdry, the whole afternoon curdled by the presence of death at its centre. Inside, the drawing-room had become a sort of informal assembly. Lady Forsyth sat on a delicate chair near the window, still clutching her handkerchief. Mrs. Penworthy, Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Bantry, the vicar, and Mr. Elworthy formed a small conversational orbit about her. Miss Marple, having secured her tea, took a modest seat near a side table where she could observe without appearing to do so. Inspector Blithe stood by the mantelpiece, not quite at ease, his dark travelling coat now laid aside, revealing a well-cut but slightly outdated suit. His eyes moved from face to face as they spoke, weighing, listening. "It's the most dreadful thing that has ever happened at Heathercombe," Lady Forsyth was saying faintly. "A man dying in my arboretum, at my fete. It will be in the papers. They will say my garden parties are dangerous." "My dear Lady Forsyth," the vicar soothed, "one cannot hold oneself responsible for all the calamities that choose one's house as a stage. Consider Job. Consider—" "I would prefer not to consider Job, if you don't mind, Mr. Pritchard," she replied with a touch more spirit. "He would not have had to cope with the local press." Quite so," murmured Mr. Elworthy. "Still, from a legal standpoint, you're undoubtedly blameless. The man was a stranger, I gather." There was a slight pause. Eyes shifted. At last, Mrs. Carter said, "Well, I've never seen him at the grocer's or the post office, and that surely means he's not from the village. Everyone comes to the grocer's sooner or later." "And yet," said Blithe, speaking for the first time since they had come indoors, "he had the look of someone who'd been travelling some distance. Dust on the hem of his coat, his shoes worn at the edges. Not what one usually finds at a society garden party." His voice was calm, almost detached, but Miss Marple noticed the faint tightening of his hands behind his back. "You examined him quite thoroughly, Inspector," ventured the vicar with an apologetic little cough. "If I may still call you Inspector." Blythe's mouth twisted as though at a private irony. "Arthur will do, Mr. Pritchard. I no longer hold the title officially." Mrs. Penworthy leaned forward. "But you were an inspector, and a very famous one, they say. The Greenridge counterfeiters." "We need not go into that now," Blithe interrupted, rather more sharply than the occasion seemed to require. "My past occupation is hardly the point." "Oh, but it is in a way," said Mrs. Bantry, "because it means we have someone here who knows what to do. Until the police arrive, I mean. They do take an age, you know, from the county station." "We have a constable," put in Mrs. Carter. "Constable Briggs will be here in no time." "Constable Briggs," said Mrs. Penworthy with emphasis, "could not find a missing hen in a hen house. You know very well he lost that bicycle of his for 2 days, and it turned out to be behind his own shed." Now, ladies," murmured the vicar, glancing uneasily at Blithe. "We must not disparage the authorities." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes very mild. She noticed how, at the mention of the local constable, Blythe's expression became shuttered, almost resigned, as though he anticipated awkwardness. Gossip, like smoke, always sought a direction in which to drift. Already it was curling toward Blithe. "If you don't mind my asking," Lady Forsyth said, with the air of someone tentatively prodding a sore place, "what did bring you back to Heathercombe, Arthur, after all these years? It seems such a coincidence, you arriving today of all days, and then someone dies," Blithe finished for her. There was a brief silence. "I had my reasons for coming," he added at last. "Private reasons. They have nothing to do with this man, I assure you. I've never seen him before in my life." Miss Marple watched this statement settle among the assembled company like a piece of furniture no one quite knew where to put. Truth, she reflected, was like that rather often. Of course," Lady Forsyth said quickly, though she did not look wholly comforted. "I did not mean to suggest—" "People do not usually mean to suggest what they suggest," Miss Marple thought. Aloud she merely asked in her gentle way, You did not happen to notice his hands, dear Arthur? Blithe turned to her with a faint frown. His hands. Yes, strong. Some ink stains on the right index finger. Why do you ask, Miss Marple? Oh, for no particular reason, she said vaguely. I once knew a man who developed the most dreadful rash because of ink. The doctor said it was due to constant nib usage. Such things can tell you quite a lot about a person's occupation. Ah, said Blithe slowly. You mean he may have been a clerk, or a man used to writing a good deal? His eyes narrowed a fraction. Just a casual observation, was it? Oh, quite casual, said Miss Marple, folding her thin hands. One notices such things, living in a village. People's troubles tend to show on their extremities, I always think. Their shoes, their hands, their faces. Before Blithe could reply, the rumble of a motor car sounded in the drive, followed shortly by the unmistakable tread of heavy boots in the hall. Constable Briggs's voice, important and rather breathless, floated in from the doorway, accompanied by another, crisper tone. Where is her ladyship, and where is the, deceased? Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the door. So the official machinery was beginning to move. With it would come more questions, more suppositions, and, if human nature behaved in its usual way, a fair quantity of error. And somewhere, she felt quite sure, amid all the talk and distress and conjecture, lay the small, stubborn truth waiting quietly to be noticed. Constable Briggs entered with the solemnity of a man convinced that disaster had been waiting specifically for him. His helmet was slightly askew and his notebook was already in hand, though he had not yet written a single word. Beside him stood Inspector Hadley from the county, a tall, composed fellow with a clipped moustache and the kind of expression that suggested his patience had limits, though he rarely announced them. Lady Forsyth rose shakily from her chair as they approached. Inspector Hadley, thank goodness you've come. Such a dreadful thing has happened. Hadley bowed politely. We received Mr. Elworthy's message. A death on the premises, you say? His gaze swept the room, assessing, calculating. Where is the body now? In the West Arboretum, Lady Forsyth said, clasping and unclasping her hands. Covered as best we could manage. Constable Briggs will take me there, Hadley said with a firm nod. In the meantime, I'll need statements from everyone who saw the man or the scene, including those who discovered him. His eyes landed briefly on Inspector Blithe. Recognition flickering. Arthur Blithe. I didn't expect to see you back in our county. Blithe inclined his head, expression unreadable. Circumstances brought me. So I gather. Hadley held his gaze a second longer than courtesy required, then turned to Lady Forsyth. We'll keep this as orderly as possible. If everyone remains indoors for now, it will help. Miss Marple observed the subtle shift in the room as Hadley spoke. People, when given official instruction, often relax, believing that authority must automatically bring clarity. Yet beneath the veneer of relief, she sensed something else. Curiosity sharpening, suspicion simmering. A death unsettled a village far more deeply than any visiting official could have anticipated. Hadley marched away with Briggs, and for the moment, the drawing room exhaled. Mrs. Carter immediately leaned close to Mrs. Penworthy. I knew something was odd about today. You can feel it in the air, a kind of tension. My dear, that tension was simply your argument with Mrs. Dunthorne over the sponge cake scoring. Mrs. Brome, Penworthy replied tartly. But perhaps you are right. Something always goes wrong at a fete. Usually it is only the weather. It is the strangest thing, Mrs. Bantry said to Miss Marple, lowering her voice. A death right when Inspector Blithe returns. I'm sure I don't mean anything by it, but one can't help noticing. One notices all sorts of things, Miss Marple said mildly, but they don't always mean what one thinks. Blithe, standing somewhat apart from the others, seemed to hear this and offered her the faintest of acknowledgments. There was a stiffness in his posture, a brittleness in the way he held himself. Miss Marple wondered, not for the first time, whether his return to the village and the stranger's collapse were truly disconnected events. The door opened again, and Hadley reappeared sooner than expected. "I'll need to speak to you all individually," he announced. "But first, Blithe, a word with you." It was not a request. Blithe followed him into the hall, and though voices were lowered, the tone carried easily enough for Miss Marple's keen ears. "You examined the body first?" Hadley asked. "Yes," Blithe replied. "And?" "And the man was dead," Blithe said evenly. "Beyond that, I'll leave the formal conclusions to you." Hadley made a sound that suggested skepticism. "It seems very convenient that you arrive here today, after years away, and within an hour there's a dead man in Lady Forsyth's rose garden." Blithe's reply came slow, edged. "If you are implying anything—" "I imply nothing," Hadley said crisply. "But coincidence rarely satisfies me. You know that." Before Blithe could respond, a footman passed through the hall, prompting the two inspectors to pause their conversation. Hadley resumed more quietly, and Miss Marple shifted her position so she could no longer hear, though she had gleaned more than enough to understand the strain between them. When they returned to the drawing room, Hadley resumed his inspection with a brisk professionalism. "The man carried no identification," he announced. "No wallet, no letters. Only a ticket stub from the early train from Paddington. Does anyone recognize his description?" A murmur swept through the guests. "Tallish? Did he have any distinguishing marks? Did anyone speak to him at the fete?" "No one," Lady Forsyth insisted. "I did not see him at all before Ellen found him." Mrs. Penworthy sniffed. "If he'd been hanging about earlier, someone would have noticed. People do not blend into fetes so easily. There's always someone wanting to talk to you." "And yet he arrived unnoticed," Hadley said. "Quite curious." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to Blithe, whose brow had tightened. "Curious indeed." Hadley called next upon Ellen, who stood nervously twisting her apron. "I didn't see him come from anywhere," she said tremulously. "I only went to fetch Lady Forsyth's shawl, and when I came back through the arboretum, he was just lying there." "Was anyone else in the garden?" Hadley asked. "No, sir. I didn't see a soul." Hadley scribbled notes while the room fell into hushed contemplation. Miss Marple studied Ellen more closely. Honest, earnest, and rather bewildered. She doubted the girl had the imagination or desire to fabricate anything. Hadley continued through the room, questioning each person in turn. By the time he reached Miss Marple, the weight of unanswered questions hung thick in the air. "Miss Marple," he said formally, "you were present shortly after the discovery." "Yes, Inspector," she replied pleasantly. "Did you observe anything unusual?" "Only that the man seemed to have fallen rather suddenly," she said. "His arm was extended oddly, almost as if reaching for something, and there was a faint scent in the air. Bitter almonds, I thought." A silence followed. It was subtle, but Miss Marple saw Hadley's eyes sharpen, and Blithe's jaw tighten with recognition. "Poison," Mrs. Bantry whispered, horrified. "You think he was poisoned?" Hadley cleared his throat. "We cannot conclude anything yet, though your observation is not insignificant, Miss Marple." Blithe stepped forward. "If that scent was present, Hadley, then we may be dealing with cyanide." Lady Forsyth gasped. "Cyanide? At my fate?" "Not necessarily administered here," Blithe said. "He may have taken it earlier, or someone may have given it to him." Mrs. Carter clasped her pearls. "Good heavens!" Hadley raised a hand for quiet. "We'll wait for the medical examiner before drawing conclusions. In the meantime, I must ask that no one leave the manor grounds." A collective breath was drawn, half fear, half fascination. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in her lap. She had known from the moment she knelt near the fallen man that foul play was likely. Human beings rarely die in tidy coincidences at precisely the most inconvenient times. And now, with the faint almond scent confirmed, the matter shifted from curiosity to certainty. Yet something still puzzled her, not about the dead man, but about the living one. Inspector Blithe stood with his shoulders taut, his eyes shadowed by thoughts he clearly did not intend to share. He looked not surprised, but resigned, almost as though he had expected trouble to find him the moment he set foot in Heathercombe. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was very interesting indeed, for trouble sought out those who carried it with them. And Inspector Blithe, returning suddenly after 7 silent years, had arrived with far more than mere luggage. Inspector Hadley's request that no one leave the manor grounds settled over the drawing-room like a curtain, thick and immovable. Even those who had been eager to theorize fell suddenly quiet, as though aware that a line had been drawn between idle gossip and true danger. Lady Forsyth rang for more tea. People always wanted tea when confronted with uncertainty, but the tray that arrived did little to soothe the tension that whispered through the room. Miss Marple, who had seen many such rooms tense with unspoken fear, gently stirred her tea and observed the shifting currents of emotion. Fear often revealed more than calm. She watched each face as Hadley continued his measured questions. Inspector Blithe, however, seemed increasingly restless. His gaze moved to the window overlooking the arboretum, then back to Hadley, then downward to the rug, as though something in the dead man's sudden arrival was tightening around him like an invisible snare. Miss Marple noticed this with growing curiosity. Blithe was a man who had once been known for his composure, the very picture of methodical confidence. Yet now the facade trembled. Hadley closed his notebook at last and addressed the room. "Until we know more, I must treat this as a suspicious death. The medical examiner is en route. In the meantime, I'll ask you to remain available." His tone softened slightly. "I understand this has come as a shock, but we will proceed carefully." Mrs. Carter immediately clutched her handbag as though it contained her personal safety. "Does that mean the murderer is among us?" she demanded, rather too loudly. "No one has said murderer," the vicar reminded her gently. "Let us reserve judgment until the facts are clear." Mrs. Penworthy sniffed. "People who die of innocent causes do not smell of almonds, vicar." The vicar, flustered, muttered something about divine mysteries. Blithe suddenly spoke. "Hadley, if I may, I'd like to examine the man's satchel. I noticed it had fallen open. Perhaps it contains some clue to his identity." Hadley hesitated, weighing both Blithe's expertise and the delicate circumstances of his return. "Very well, but only under supervision." Blithe nodded, though it was clear he had hoped for something more trusting. Hadley gestured to Briggs, who hurried over in his awkward way. "Constable, please take Mr. Blithe back to the arboretum and observe while he examines the effects." Briggs brightened at being given a task that sounded suitably important. "Yes, sir. Follow me, Inspector. Mr. Blithe." The two men departed, and as the door closed behind them, the sudden thinning of the room's tension was almost audible. People shifted in their seats, released from the pressure of Blithe's unreadable presence. Mrs. Bantry leaned nearer Miss Marple. "What do you make of it, Jane? It's all so peculiar." Miss Marple smiled faintly into her teacup. "Peculiar things are often most enlightening. They tend to show people exactly as they are." "Oh, but the poor man," Lady Forsyth murmured, wringing her lace handkerchief. "I can't bear to think of a stranger dying in my garden, and with nothing to tell us who he was. What if he was on his way to see someone here?" "What makes you think he was?" asked Mrs. Penworthy. Lady Forsyth blinked, realizing she had spoken more boldly than intended. "Oh, I don't know. People must come for some purpose, mustn't they?" "Unless he simply wandered in," Mrs. Carter said unhelpfully. "No," Miss Marple said softly enough that only those closest to her heard. "People rarely wander into places that require some determination to reach. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. You mean he came deliberately? To Heathercombe Manor? If not the manor, then the fate, Miss Marple added. And if not the fate specifically, then someone attending it. Lady Forsyth paled. Someone here, she whispered. But who on earth? Before anxiety could blossom into full panic, the door opened again. Briggs returned, looking both flustered and proud of himself, though Blythe's expression had grown still more troubled. Hadley rose at once. Well? Blythe stepped forward, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The satchel contained very little. A change of linen, a railway timetable, some coins. But this, he unwrapped the cloth, was tucked into an inner pocket. The room leaned collectively forward. Inside the cloth lay a small leather-bound notebook, weather-worn and stained at the edges. On the front cover, a single monogram was stamped in gold leaf. A.B. Lady Forsyth gasped. Mrs. Carter pressed a hand to her throat. Mrs. Penworthy blinked rapidly, as though her eyes refused to believe what they saw. Blythe's face had turned a shade paler. The initials are mine, he said quietly. But I assure you, I have never seen this notebook before. Hadley narrowed his eyes. Are you certain? Blythe met his gaze. Absolutely. Hadley took the notebook from him with the utmost care, as though its very leather might explode into revelations. He opened it slowly. The first page was blank. The second contained a list of dates, the earliest from several years ago. No names, no explanations, just dates. The final entry, circled twice, bore today's date. Hadley's voice dropped. It appears he was coming to see you, Blythe. A murmur of shock swept the room, more potent than before. Blythe stiffened. I don't know the man. I've said as much. But his notebook suggests otherwise, Mrs. Carter breathed, equally frightened and thrilled. Mrs. Penworthy nodded vigorously. People don't carry the initials of strangers in their pockets, not unless they have business with them. Blythe's jaw tightened. Whatever business he had, he never reached me. Hadley was studying him with careful, restrained suspicion. Arthur, what exactly brought you back to Heathercombe today? Blythe hesitated. It was a brief pause, barely a heartbeat, but in that small suspension, Miss Marple heard the weight of something unspoken, not deceit necessarily, but reluctance, a reluctance that hinted at trouble deeper than mere embarrassment. Personal matters, Blythe said at last. Matters unrelated to this man? Hadley seemed unconvinced. For your sake, I hope that's true, because this notebook complicates matters considerably. Miss Marple watched the two men, the tension between them stretching like an invisible thread. She closed her eyes briefly, thinking. A dead man arriving with a notebook bearing another man's initials. This was not coincidence, but neither was it proof of guilt. Human beings, she knew well, tended to shape their own doom long before events brought it to fruition. Inspector Hadley, she said softly, drawing all eyes back to her. Might I look at the notebook? Old eyes see differently from young ones. Sometimes we notice what others overlook. Hadley, after a brief hesitation, handed it to her. Miss Marple opened it with delicate care. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages. Feeling the texture of the paper, the faint indentations of pencil where a note had once been written and erased. Then, flipping to the inside back cover, she noticed something faint, a scrap of paper half tucked into the binding. Oh dear, she murmured. Whoever owned this notebook was rather careless. What do you see? Hadley asked sharply. Miss Marple slipped the scrap free. On it, written in hurried, uneven script, were just 3 words. Meet before Blithe. The room fell deathly silent, and Miss Marple, in her quiet, unassuming way, felt the entire puzzle shift, just slightly, into a new and far more sinister shape. A breath seemed to catch in the collective throat of the room as Miss Marple read the 3 words aloud. Even those inclined toward exaggeration and melodrama felt the quiet weight of the message. It was not theatrical. It was not florid. It was stark. A practical warning, hastily scrawled by someone who had no time to choose better phrasing. Inspector Hadley stepped closer. "Let me see that." He took the scrap from Miss Marple's steady fingers and studied it with a sharp frown. "Meet before Blithe. What on earth does it mean? Before Blithe arrived, or—" His eyes shifted toward the former inspector. "Or before someone else reached you?" Blythe's expression hardened, though there was an unmistakable flicker of alarm. "You're reading too much into a fragment. We don't even know the scrap belonged to the dead man. It might have been wedged in the binding for years." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "The paper is crisp at the edges, not yellowed, and the handwriting is quite hurried. It was likely placed there recently, perhaps even this morning." Mrs. Carter gasped in a manner that suggested she had been waiting for an opportunity to gasp again. Then the poor man must have been on his way to meet someone he needed to reach before Inspector Blithe did. "But whom?" Mrs. Penworthy demanded, leaning forward so sharply that her pearls clicked. Who on earth would want to meet a stranger before speaking to Arthur Blithe? Mrs. Bantry, who had been unusually quiet, murmured, "Unless they wished to prevent a meeting between the two of them." A ripple of unease spread outward. Lady Forsyth's hand fluttered to her throat. Surely no one here would be involved in such a dreadful business. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Penworthy said with the confidence of one who believes herself immune to scandal. "One never knows what people in small villages get up to. One hears things." "Indeed one does," Miss Marple said mildly, "though one should be careful to separate what one hears from what one can be certain of." Hadley began to pace, a habit he generally avoided but seemed unable to resist now. "We need to identify the dead man. Until then, we're working backwards from shadows." "Blithe, you said you've never seen him." "Never," Blithe replied. But there was an undertone, a faint, involuntary hesitation that made Hadley stop pacing. The silence that followed was long enough to make Lady Forsyth's teacups tremble on their saucers. Hadley spoke again. "You seem troubled. Is there something you haven't told us?" Blithe hesitated, a real hesitation this time, not a flicker. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She recognized the moment, the thin border between withholding and confessing, where the truth nudges at the conscience like a sparrow tapping a window. At last, Blithe sighed. "I came back to Heathercombe because I received a letter, anonymous. It said someone wished to speak to me urgently about an old case. A matter of life and death, they wrote. The letter asked me to come today, to Heathercombe Manor, because I would find the writer here." A rush of whispers swept the room. "Why didn't you say that earlier?" Hadley demanded. "Because the letter mentioned no name," Blithe retorted with a flare of defensiveness. "It gave no description, no signature. I couldn't very well accuse anyone based on that." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at him. "Did the letter mention the location of Heathercombe Manor precisely? The Arboretum, for instance?" "The Arboretum." Blithe blinked, surprised by the specificity of the question. "No, it simply said I would find the writer here, at the fete." "So the dead man may have been the one who wrote the letter," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed, "though one should not be too quick to assume. The world is full of anonymous letters written by people who are not the ones they concern." Hadley crossed his arms. But if the stranger was indeed the letter's author, it would explain why he came. It would also explain why his notebook had Blythe's initials. But how would he have obtained Blythe's initials? Mrs. Penworthy asked, frowning. "Those were printed in the papers for years," Mrs. Carter reminded her. Arthur Blythe. Everyone knew the name." Miss Marple inclined her head. Even so, the possession of such a notebook suggests a degree of personal intention. Whether friendly or hostile remains to be seen. A faint tremor ran through Lady Forsyth. Hostile? Oh, Miss Marple, do you truly think— I think, Miss Marple said gently, that if one is to understand human behavior, one must be open to many possibilities. A footman appeared at the doorway. Inspector Hadley, sir. The medical examiner has arrived. Hadley nodded briskly. I'll join him. No one leaves this room without permission. But as he turned to go, Miss Marple rose delicately from her seat. Inspector, would it be permissible for me to accompany you? My experience with small peculiarities may prove useful. I shan't interfere. Hadley considered her. Though he had not known Miss Marple long, he had already registered that she possessed an unsettling clarity of perception. He gave a curt nod. Very well. But please remain outside the immediate examination area. Of course, Miss Marple said, following him with unhurried steps. Blithe watched her go with an odd expression, part admiration, part dread, as though he feared she might discern something he himself did not wish to confront. They crossed the hall and went out through the French doors towards the arboretum. The air was cooler now, twilight brushing the roses with a faint silver sheen. The white sheet still covered the man's body, though the examiner, a calm, wiry gentleman accustomed to tragedy, was setting out his tools with efficient precision. As they approached, a faint scent lingered in the air. Miss Marple breathed in quietly. It was less pronounced now, but unmistakable, a whisper of bitter almonds that clung to the summer breeze like a ghost. The medical examiner knelt and lifted the sheet. Male, approximately mid-50s, he said. No visible wounds. Rigor not fully set. I'll confirm at the post-mortem, but the scent suggests cyanide. Hadley crouched beside him. Time of death? Roughly 1 hour ago, perhaps a little more. Miss Marple, standing a few paces behind, studied the man's face. It was lined, weathered, but not harsh. A man accustomed to stress, perhaps, but not violence. His hands told another story, ink stains, as Blithe had noted, but also faint calluses at the thumb and forefinger, the sort acquired from opening envelopes repeatedly or sorting through papers. A clerk? A secretary? Or perhaps someone whose work required sifting through other people's secrets. As Hadley thanked the examiner and stood, Miss Marple lifted her gaze to the arboretum path. A small detail caught her eye, a set of footprints that trailed off toward a side gate, not the main path and not the direction the guests had taken. The prints were shallow, almost hesitant, as though the walker had moved quickly but lightly. Inspector, she said quietly, did you notice those footprints earlier? Hadley followed her gesture and frowned. Those weren't there when we first arrived. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. Which suggests that someone came here after the commotion began. Someone who wished not to be seen. Hadley's jaw tightened. Briggs, he called sharply. But the constable did not appear at once. Miss Marple looked again at the footprints, then at the still figure beneath the sheet. Someone had come back to the scene, not to mourn, not to confess, but to make certain of something. And whatever they wished to be certain of, Miss Marple suspected it was something the dead man had carried with him, or something he had meant to say. Something, or someone, they feared Inspector Blithe might discover first. Briggs finally appeared, trotting down the gravel path with the earnest determination of a man who has been shouted for, but isn't entirely sure why. His helmet wobbled precariously with each step. Yes, Inspector? Sorry. I was assisting Mrs. Penworthy, sir. She believed she saw someone suspicious near the croquet lawn, but it turned out to be a hedgehog. Hadley closed his eyes briefly, as though counting to 10. Briggs, examine the footprints leading to the side gate. No, not those. The ones Miss Marple indicated. Briggs bent over them, squinting hard. These here? Look rather like ordinary footprints to me. Sir, everything looks ordinary until one understands it, Miss Marple said kindly. She stepped closer, careful not to disturb the prints. These are lighter than those made by the medical examiner or ourselves. Someone walked quickly, perhaps even ran, and if you look closely, you'll see the right foot drags ever so slightly at the heel. Briggs peered again. Oh, so it does. You've got an eye, Miss Marple. Miss Marple gave a modest shrug, though her eyes remained fixed on the faint trail. People often reveal themselves through how they move. A limp, even a small one, can be very telling. Hadley frowned. Did any guest exhibit a limp that you noticed? Not noticeably, Miss Marple murmured, but some people walked differently only when distressed or hurried. Blithe had rejoined them by now, standing with arms folded. Hadley, whoever those prints belonged to, they were at the scene after the death. That alone makes them important. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, especially as the visitor seems to have used the side gate rather than the path to the house. The inspector's face tightened, as though they wished to avoid being seen. Miss Marple nodded gently. A perfectly natural wish for someone who has just ensured something was present or absent before leaving. Hadley spun toward her. You mean they came back to take something? Or to confirm that something was no longer there, Miss Marple said. There is a distinct difference, Inspector, and human behavior tends to follow certain patterns. Blithe exhaled sharply. If this man carried something relating to my old cases, that's precisely what concerns me. Hadley cut in. You say you received an anonymous letter asking for a meeting about an old matter. That could imply someone fears what might resurface. Miss Marple, her gaze drifting momentarily to the sheet-covered figure, said softly, and perhaps someone else feared it enough to act before your meeting could take place. They returned to the drawing room as the evening deepened outside, the air cooling with the first hints of night. Lamps glowed softly, casting pools of golden light that only seemed to heighten the tension. The villagers had not dispersed. Their anxious chatter dimmed only when Miss Marple, Hadley, and Blithe entered, all eyes turning to the trio at once. Lady Forsyth rose immediately. Inspector, do you know any more? Hadley shook his head. For now, we've determined that the man likely died of cyanide poisoning. We are still piecing together his purpose here. He was looking for someone, Mrs. Carter said breathlessly. Wasn't he? He must have been. Possibly, Hadley allowed, but until we can confirm the identity of the deceased, all theories remain unsubstantiated. Blythe's face remained impassive, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his posture increase with each speculative remark. His past was being dredged to the surface before a roomful of fascinated villagers. It was not a comfortable thing for a private man. The hush continued until Miss Marple, who rarely sought the room's attention but never shied from speaking when necessary, addressed Lady Forsyth. My dear, you have kept meticulous records of fete attendees over the years, have you not? Lady Forsyth blinked, flustered. Why, yes, of course. For the programs, prize listings, and such. I've always felt organization was the backbone of a successful event. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, we might consult the guest registry for this year. It would help us determine whether the stranger signed in or whether someone else attended without proper notice. Mrs. Penworthy gasped. Unsigned guests, just imagine. Anyone could walk in. Well, yes, Mrs. Carter replied tartly. It is a public fete. But Miss Marple's eyes were still fixed on Lady Forsyth, who nodded nervously. The list is in the study. I could fetch it. I'll come with you, Miss Marple said in a tone both kind and firm, for she suspected Lady Forsyth was close to tears and needed the comfort of purpose. They walked together down the hall, Lady Forsyth's steps wavering slightly. Miss Marple, she said in a low, trembling voice, you don't think this all has something to do with Arthur, do you? He's been a dear friend for years. I know he left the force abruptly, but he's not the sort to... Well, to be mixed up in something dangerous. Miss Marple gave her arm a reassuring squeeze. One must never assume the worst of people we know, my dear, but nor should one assume the best of strangers. Let us simply seek the truth. Lady Forsyth managed a small, grateful smile as they entered the study. The guest ledger lay on a polished desk, a heavy leather book with gold edging. Lady Forsyth flipped it open, skimming down the neat lines of signatures. "Everyone signs, you see," she said breathlessly. "It's tradition." "Most sign," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Not everyone." They scanned the list together. Familiar names filled the pages. The vicar, Mrs. Bantry, the Penworthys, the local doctor, 2 tourists from Whitstable, but no unfamiliar signature matched a man in his 50s. And then Miss Marple saw it. A blank space. No signature between the entries for the Dunthorne twins and the Flower Arrangers Society. An empty gap where someone should have signed. She touched the space lightly. "This is interesting." Lady Forsyth paled. "Someone slipped in without putting their name down." "Not slipped in," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Entered deliberately, with purpose enough to ignore the polite tradition, either because they wished to remain anonymous or because they feared their name being recognized." The 2 women stared at the gap in silence. When they returned to the drawing room, Hadley took the ledger at once, flipping through the pages with growing interest. Blithe watched him, jaw set. "Someone was here who didn't wish to be noticed," Hadley said at last. "Someone who may have met the dead man and possibly even poisoned him." Miss Marple, her expression serene but her mind sharp as ever, added, "And someone who may very well still be inside this house." A hush fell thick and heavy. Even the ticking clock on the mantel seemed to pause. Inside her calm blue eyes, Miss Marple saw the truth beginning to uncoil. Not fully, not yet, but enough to know that the village harbored secrets deeper than anyone wished to admit. And one of those secrets was now walking quietly among them, hoping that suspicion continued to cling stubbornly to Arthur Blithe. Because suspicion, once misplaced, often served as the murderer's most faithful ally. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet pronouncement was almost physical, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. Even the rustling skirts and shifting chairs stilled. Lady Forsyth pressed a hand to her throat again, but this time the gesture lacked its usual elegance. It was the nervous reflex of someone suddenly aware that danger might be far closer than polite company allowed. Inspector Hadley closed the guest ledger with a decisive snap. "No one leaves this room until I've conducted further questioning. If there is someone among us who avoided signing the register, I intend to know why." Mrs. Carter clutched her handbag more tightly. "But surely you don't mean to imply—" "I imply nothing," Hadley said sharply. "Not yet." Miss Marple observed the room with the practiced calm of one who had watched many storms gather beneath the surface of genteel conversation. What she noted now was subtle but telling. The brief flicker of alarm in the vicar's eyes, Mrs. Penworthy's sudden fascination with adjusting her glove buttons, the way Blithe shifted restlessly, as though the walls were closing in. Fear expressed itself differently in each person, but fear had a voice even when unspoken. Hadley stepped forward. "We'll proceed with additional statements. Miss Marple, Lady Forsyth, thank you for bringing this to my attention. Now, if everyone will remain seated." He was interrupted by the hurried entrance of the footman who had earlier fetched tea. His face was flushed, his breath coming quickly. "Inspector Hadley, sir. You asked that the grounds continue to be monitored. One of the gardeners reports. He says someone was seen near the side gate earlier, a person running toward the lane." Hadley stiffened. "When?" "A few minutes ago, sir. He only just came to find me." Miss Marple set down her teacup. A few minutes ago meant after their examination of the footprints. Whoever had left the scene earlier might have decided to return once more. perhaps to ensure they hadn't overlooked something. Hadley gestured briskly. "Show me exactly where. Blithe, stay here. I don't need you wandering after anonymous letters." Blythe's jaw tightened. "Hadley, that wasn't a request." Blithe subsided, though resentment flickered behind his eyes. Miss Marple felt a ripple of sympathy for him. A man returning after years away should not have to confront suspicion and death within the hour, but life often arranged itself without regard for fairness. Hadley left with the footman, Briggs scurrying behind. The room resumed a low murmur, quickly building into competing theories. "It must have been a stranger," Mrs. Penworthy was saying. "No one respectable runs anywhere unless they've done something they shouldn't." Mrs. Carter sniffed. "Respectable people run when bees are after them, Mabel. It does happen." Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple again. "Jane, do you really think the murderer could be someone here? Someone we see every day?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, anything is possible. Human nature, as I often say, is quite remarkably consistent whether one lives in a village or a city. People conceal things, even from themselves." Blithe spoke suddenly from across the room, his voice low. "Miss Marple." She turned to him with polite interest. "You found the scrap in the notebook," he said. "What do you think it means?" "Truly." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I think it means that the dead man was meant to meet someone prior to speaking with you, someone who feared you might learn something if he reached you first." Blithe absorbed this in silence. He looked, Miss Marple thought, like a man grappling not with accusation but with unwanted memory. She wondered what old case had drawn him back, what unfinished business had resurfaced after 7 long years. Lady Forsyth, who had been watching Blithe anxiously, ventured, "Arthur, you don't suppose this has anything to do with your disappearance from the force? I never understood why you left so suddenly." No one did. The room hinged on this question. The villagers, always hungry for stories, leaned forward. But Blithe shook his head, though with hesitation. "I left for private reasons," he said. "Reasons that concern no one here." Mrs. Penworthy's eyebrows shot upward. "Private reasons are exactly the sort that do concern others." "Not in this case," Blithe replied sharply. Miss Marple watched him, quiet but attentive. There were many kinds of refusals, those made from pride, those from guilt, and those from fear of misunderstanding. Blythe's refusal had the flavor of a man trying to keep a door closed, not because something wicked lay behind it, but because something painful did. Before she could reflect further, Hadley reappeared in the doorway, bringing a gust of cold evening air with him. "We found the gardener," he announced. "He claims he saw a figure running through the side gate, headed toward the lane. Couldn't see their face, it was getting dark, but he did notice something unusual about their gait. A slight limp." A murmur swept through the room. "Ha, the footprints," Miss Marple said softly. "Of course." Hadley nodded. "Yes, they match what we saw. Someone returned to the scene and then fled. That someone is either a witness or a suspect." Mrs. Carter raised a trembling hand. "Inspector, do you mean to say the killer is somewhere nearby?" Hadley's mouth tightened. "I mean to say that they may already have left the grounds. Briggs is searching the lane now." Miss Marple felt a stir of doubt. Briggs, though earnest, had a gift for losing objects, including, on one memorable occasion, a horse, and she doubted he would catch anyone fleet enough to slip through hedges in the dimming light. "Inspector," she said gently, "are you certain the person fled away from the house?" Hadley blinked. "Of course." "If they ran to the lane—" "But a lane leads both ways," Miss Marple reminded him, "and a person wishing to disappear might head not toward the village, where they could be seen, but toward the old woods. There are paths there long forgotten by most." Blithe straightened. "You mean the paths behind the old mill? They lead to the ruins?" Miss Marple nodded. and from the ruins to a small track that eventually rejoins the main road. A clever person might use it to avoid being seen. Hadley's irritation vanished, replaced by begrudging admiration. "Miss Marple, you surprise me every time." "Oh," she murmured, "I doubt that." He called for Briggs immediately to redirect the search. Briggs nearly collided with a footman as he ran out, helmet askew once more. The momentary commotion faded, leaving the room in uneasy quiet again. Blithe sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "Whoever that man was," he muttered, "I never even met him. Yet he crossed half the country to reach me, and died before he could say a word." Miss Marple regarded him with gentle gravity. "Some journeys end abruptly, Mr. Blithe, but they begin for very specific reasons." Blithe looked up. "Do you think this has to do with the Greenridge case?" "It was the last major case I worked before I resigned." Miss Marple hesitated, as though testing the weight of the possibility. "Perhaps. Or perhaps a different matter entirely, one connected to your past in a way you have not yet considered." "But who would write to me after all these years?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window, where the first stars pricked the night sky. "Someone," she said softly, "who believed you carried a truth they could no longer carry alone." Blithe stared at her, startled. And at that moment, a sound echoed faintly from the far corridor, a sharp crash, followed by a cry. Every head in the drawing-room turned. Hadley was already moving. "Stay here," he ordered, drawing in a breath that promised urgency and danger. But Miss Marple was already rising, her expression calm yet alert, for she had recognized the cry. Someone important to the truth, had just discovered something, or had been silenced before they could reveal it. The corridor felt colder than the drawing-room, as though the house itself sensed something unfolding within its walls. Hadley strode ahead, footsteps sharp against the polished floor, while Miss Marple followed with her small, unhurried steps that somehow never failed to bring her exactly where she needed to be. The others hovered at the drawing-room threshold, murmuring anxiously but too afraid, or too wise, to follow. The cry had come from the direction of the East Gallery, a seldom-used hallway lined with ancestral portraits whose stern faces now seemed to glower in the dim light. A narrow console table lay overturned, its vase shattered across the carpet in glittering fragments. And beside it, half sitting, half collapsed against the wall, was Ellen the maid, her apron skewed, her breath coming in frantic gasps. Hadley knelt beside her at once. "Ellen, what happened? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though she was trembling too violently for the answer to reassure anyone. No, sir. Oh, sir, it was terrible. I didn't mean to scream, but I was so frightened." Miss Marple lowered herself gracefully to Ellen's other side, laying a steadying hand on the girl's arm. "There now, my dear. Take your time. You've had a shock. Tell us what you saw." Ellen swallowed hard. "I was coming down the corridor to fetch extra candles. Lady Forsyth asked for them, and then I saw a figure just ahead of me, near the gallery alcove. I thought it was one of the guests at first, maybe looking at the portraits, but then they moved so quickly, so oddly, and when I called out, they ran. They knocked over the table as they went." Hadley's eyes narrowed. "Did you recognize them? See their face?" "No, sir. It was too dark, but—" She hesitated, fingers twisting in her apron. But the person was limping. A beat of silence followed. Hadley exchanged a sharp glance with Miss Marple. "The same limp," he said, "the one from the footprints." Miss Marple nodded slightly. It seems our mysterious visitor did not leave the house after all. Ellen's eyes widened. "You mean they're still here?" Hadley stood abruptly. "Yes, and they may have returned to search for something." Blithe had arrived by then, along with Lady Forsyth and the vicar, who all hovered anxiously in the doorway. Lady Forsyth exclaimed, "Helen, my poor girl, come, we must get you some brandy." Ellen was practically swept away by Lady Forsyth and Mrs. Bantry, leaving the corridor to the investigators. "I want every room on this floor searched," Hadley ordered briskly. "Briggs will handle the gallery. Blithe, stay where I can see you." Blithe bristled. "For heaven's sake, Hadley. Until I understand what's going on, I'm not taking chances." Hadley turned to Miss Marple. "And you, please stay back from danger." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I assure you, Inspector, danger and I have an understanding. It rarely finds me unless I seek it out." Hadley gave a curt, resigned nod and moved ahead, inspecting the alcove and the long shadows cast by the portraits. Miss Marple lingered by the fallen table, studying the scattered shards. People in panic often left behind more than broken objects. One fragment caught her eye, a sliver with a faint smear of something pale. She touched it delicately. Paint. Fresh paint. Her gaze lifted to the portraits. They were old, their varnish yellowed with age. But one, the third from the end, looked different now that she regarded it with purpose. Not newer, exactly, but recently cleaned. The edges of the frame gleamed in a way the others did not. She moved closer. The portrait depicted a man with a severe gaze, a gold watch chain across his waistcoat. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Jonathan Forsyth, 1862–1899. Blithe approached, curiosity stirring. "Miss Marple, what is it?" She gestured toward the frame. "This portrait has been handled recently. Perhaps moved. Perhaps opened." "Opened," Blithe echoed, frowning. But when he reached out and pressed lightly at the lower corner, the frame shifted. A hidden hinge creaked softly. Hadley whirled back just in time to see Blithe swing the portrait forward like a door. Behind it was a small recess carved into the wall, an old hiding place, messy with dust except for a clean rectangular space. "Something was kept here," Blithe said quietly. "Recently removed." Hadley examined the recess with growing irritation. "Briggs should have checked the gallery earlier. Someone's been tampering with this." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "A person returns to the arboretum to ensure something is gone, then later checks this hiding place. They were quite determined to know whether an object had been left, or if it had been taken." Blithe stared at the empty recess. "Was this what the stranger carried? Something relating to one of my old cases?" "The more pressing question," Miss Marple said gently, "is whether he intended to leave something for you here. But someone else found it first." Hadley turned to Blithe. "Tell me plainly, was this house, or Lady Forsyth's family, involved in any of your past investigations? Any connection whatsoever?" Blithe shook his head slowly. "No. I've never even been inside this house before today." Miss Marple's gaze didn't leave the empty recess. "Then the hiding place must have been used by someone else, someone local, someone who knew of it and repurposed it." "Lady Forsyth?" Hadley asked. "Oh, no," Miss Marple said immediately. "Lady Forsyth is many things, but secretive is not one of them. She would have posted an announcement if she ever found a hidden compartment in her own walls." Hadley suppressed a grim smile. "Then who?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the portraits lining the hall. "Families pass down many things," she murmured. "Secrets, perhaps. Most of all." Blithe was frowning in concentration. "If the stranger was meant to meet me at the fete, and then hide something here, but someone else intercepted it, then the killer's motive," Miss Marple said softly, "may not have been to silence him entirely. Rather, to prevent him from delivering what he wished to give you." Hadley stiffened. "But if he arrived with nothing but a satchel—" "We do not yet know that," Miss Marple said. "A frightened man hides things, and a desperate man seeks them." There was a pause, heavy with implication. Blithe asked in a low voice, "Miss Marple, what do you think he meant to bring me?" She turned to him, her expression gentle yet grave. Something, she said, that someone else was willing to kill to keep from reaching your hands. And from the far end of the corridor, a new sound echoed. A door clicking shut, softly but unmistakably. Not from the gallery. From the direction of the old servant's wing. Hadley stiffened. Blithe froze. Miss Marple's eyes brightened just slightly. The faint spark of a mind fitting pieces together even as the danger crept nearer. Someone had been listening, and someone had just slipped away into the deeper shadows of the house. Hadley was already moving toward the servant's wing before anyone spoke, his stride sharp, purposeful. Blithe followed immediately, a darker determination in his expression, as though the fleeing figure might carry answers he had waited years to hear. Miss Marple came last, but though her steps were small, she never seemed to fall behind. Some people rushed headlong into danger. Others, like Miss Marple, simply allowed danger to reveal itself in its eagerness to flee. The corridor narrowed as they approached the old wing, the air cooling, the walls losing their polish and elegance. The plush carpets of the main house gave way to worn runners, the sort trodden down through generations of quiet domestic work. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar, the source of the soft click they had heard. Hadley lifted a hand, signaling for silence. He pressed the door wider with the tip of his finger and stepped inside. The servants' wing drawing room was dark, save for the weak glow of a single wall sconce. Dust motes floated in the beam of light. A lace curtain near the far window fluttered faintly, whether from the open window or a recent passage, none could tell at first glance. The room felt occupied not by a person, but by the remnants of someone's presence, as though the air still held the echo of their hurried breath. No one spoke. It was Blithe who found the first sign, a small scrap of paper on the ground near the window, crushed slightly as though stepped on in haste. He bent to retrieve it. Hadley stood close behind him, watching his movements closely. "Well?" Hadley asked. Blithe opened the scrap carefully. His face tightened. "It's another note," he said. "Part of something larger. Torn, perhaps. It reads only, 'Cannot delay. He must know.'" Hadley's frown deepened. "He must know. About what? Who is he?" Miss Marple moved closer, her gaze resting thoughtfully on the torn edge of the paper. "It appears someone was writing in great haste. People rarely tear paper jaggedly unless time weighs heavily upon them." Blithe read the fragment again, softer this time. This handwriting, it might belong to the dead man. Hadley leaned in, examining the letters. Same slant as the one in the notebook. Likely the same hand. Miss Marple glanced toward the window. "Inspector Hadley, might I trouble you to look at the sill? Just there, where the dust is disturbed." Hadley crossed the room in 2 strides. Indeed, the layer of dust bore a fresh streak, as though someone had steadied themselves or leaned out. And beyond the window, the narrow path leading toward the old laundry garden stretched into the darkness. "He left this way," Hadley said grimly. "Slipped through the window and into the garden." "And in a hurry," Miss Marple added gently. "One does not leap from windows unless one feels cornered." "Cornered," Blithe repeated. "By what or whom?" Before Miss Marple could answer, footsteps thundered down the hall, and Constable Briggs stumbled into the doorway, panting heavily. "Inspector Hadley, sir. Lord preserve us. I've found something." Hadley straightened. "Where?" "In the old laundry garden, sir. Behind the hedge." I think it's important." Hadley wasted no time. "Show me." As they followed Briggs down the narrow back stair, Miss Marple noticed the tremble in the constable's hands. Briggs was not a man easily shaken. Inept, yes, but not faint-hearted. Whatever he had found, it had rattled him more than a hedgehog or misplaced bicycle ever could. The laundry garden lay behind a row of clipped hedges, a secluded patch where no visitors from the fete would have wandered. The moonlight spilled thin silver across the paving stones, revealing the usual clutter of gardening pots and old laundry troughs. But behind the hedge, partially hidden beneath a tangle of ivy, Briggs pointed at a shape on the ground. A shoe. A man's shoe, scuffed, muddied, and unmistakably belonging to someone who had run a great deal today. "And there's this, sir," Briggs added, handing Hadley a second object wrapped in his handkerchief. Hadley unwrapped it. Inside lay a thin envelope. Blithe sucked in a breath. "That envelope, it's the same stationery the anonymous letter was written on." Hadley turned it over. It bore no name, no address, only a seal of wax, cracked slightly at the edge. He opened it carefully, holding it to the moonlight. The letter inside was brief. "Blithe. I cannot speak openly. Too many eyes watch the village. If I do not reach you in time, look where Jonathan Forsythe left his truth. It concerns the trial you closed. The one they said ended cleanly. It did not. A." Blythe's face drained of color. Hadley looked sharply at him. "What trial? What truth?" Blithe swallowed. "The Greenridge trial, the last one I oversaw?" Miss Marple observed him with steady compassion. "You left the force shortly after, did you not?" Blithe nodded slowly. "There were complications, uncertainties I could not resolve. The evidence felt too neat, too perfectly arranged. But the investigation concluded without room for doubt. I tried to raise concerns, but the superintendent wanted it closed. And then I resigned." Hadley stared at him. "And this letter suggests the trial did not end as neatly as you believed." Miss Marple touched the edge of the letter with a careful fingertip. "And that someone connected to Jonathan Forsythe, the gentleman in the portrait, kept something hidden, something that others did not want you to find." Lady Forsythe, having followed with the vicar at a distance, paled visibly. "Jonathan, but he died years before the Greenridge affair." Miss Marple nodded softly. "Which means the secret was older still, and perhaps inherited by someone in this house. And someone," Hadley said slowly, "killed the man who tried to reveal it." The wind rustled the hedges, whispering through the garden as though carrying secrets buried for decades. Blithe stared at the shoe, the torn notes, the empty hiding place behind Jonathan Forsythe's portrait. "He came to deliver the truth," Blithe said bitterly, "and instead he died before he could utter a word." Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. "Not quite before. He left fragments, enough perhaps to lead us where he wished to guide you." Hadley straightened. "We will search the house again. Every wing, every room. Someone is hiding something, and someone may still be within these walls." As he gave instructions to Briggs, Miss Marple stepped aside, looking toward the dark path behind the hedge. Her eyes narrowed gently. Something about the shoe's position, the angle, the way the hedge was disturbed. The figure who fled through the window had not run blindly. They had known exactly where to go, for only someone familiar with Heathercombe Manor's forgotten corners would have fled toward a place hidden from the casual eye, and only someone who feared discovery would abandon a shoe in their haste. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. The circle of suspects was no longer wide. It was tightening, gradually, inevitably. And somewhere in the house, even now, someone was listening to every word they spoke. The house seemed to breathe with them as they re-entered it, as though the old walls of Heathercombe Manor strained to hold secrets that no longer wished to remain quiet. Hadley ordered Briggs to seal the exits and begin a thorough sweep of the upper floors, while the remaining guests, restless, murmuring, pale with a mixture of dread and excitement, were shepherded back toward the main drawing room for safety. But Miss Marple did not follow them immediately. Instead, she paused in the corridor, allowing the noise of anxious villagers to fade behind her. Her eyes drifted once more toward the servants' wing, then to the direction of the east gallery, The house's layout told a story long before words did. Certain hallways welcomed footsteps, others discouraged them, and people, especially guilty people, chose their paths according to instinct, not reason. She found Blithe standing apart from the others, leaning against a paneled wall near the staircase. The lantern light revealed the weariness etched around his eyes, the shadow of unresolved years pressing against him like a physical weight. "Miss Marple," he said quietly as she approached, "I can't escape the feeling that this is somehow my fault, that I drew this man here, that he died because of some unfinished thread I should have pursued years ago." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "My dear Mr. Blithe, truth can sleep for a very long time, but it rarely dies. If this matter has resurfaced now, it is because someone wished to awaken it, not because you returned." He looked at her, a question forming but unspoken. Miss Marple continued, "You did not choose his coming, but someone chose to prevent his message from reaching you." Blithe exhaled slowly. "Then the murderer, whoever they are, knew he was coming." "Most likely," Miss Marple agreed, "which suggests a familiarity with the dead man's purpose, and perhaps with the contents of that hidden recess." Hadley returned at that moment, brisk and irritated, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of concern beneath his professional exterior. "Briggs is securing the second floor. No one has been found yet. Either our suspect is very clever or very desperate. Possibly both." "Desperate people hide well," Miss Marple murmured. "Clever ones hide even better." Lady Forsyth, wringing her hands anxiously, approached them. "Inspector Hadley, must we remain gathered together like this? The villagers are growing frantic." "They will remain in sight," Hadley replied firmly, "until I know who should not be." Lady Forsyth swallowed hard. I've always believed Heathercombe to be a peaceful village. But now with Luther's death—" "Luther," Blithe interrupted sharply. "Is that the stranger's name?" Lady Forsyth blinked at her own mistake. "Heavens, no, I didn't mean— Oh dear, I don't know why that name came to me. Perhaps from one of the prize cards from earlier. Forgive me, I'm frightfully unsettled." Miss Marple, however, noted every flicker of discomfort. People often revealed more when speaking carelessly than when carefully guarded. Hadley guided Lady Forsyth back toward the drawing room before continuing the search. Miss Marple followed at a distance, listening to the villagers' disjointed chatter. It spilled outward in nervous waves. "Never seen anything like it. Poison, they say. Terrible way to go. Blythe's return must be connected. Someone in this house must know something." Miss Marple let the words wash over her without absorbing their hysteria. Panic rarely yielded truth, but amidst it, voices occasionally slipped, said more than intended. Mrs. Penworthy, for instance, chattered about the gallery and the portraits with unusual insistence. The vicar's wife asked whether doors to unused rooms had been locked. Mr. Elworthy lingered near windows, glancing toward the drive as though expecting an arrival, or fearing one. Miss Marple watched all of them, her mind turning over small details, like stones in a stream. Hadley suddenly reappeared at the doorway. "Miss Marple, Blithe, come with me. Briggs found something." They followed him upstairs to the landing outside the old nursery. The air was cooler here, tinged with the faint scent of cedar from disused trunks. Briggs stood awkwardly by the open door, pointing toward the window seat. "There, sir. That's where I found it." Hadley stepped closer, lifting a soft woolen scarf from the cushion, a rich burgundy color, clearly expensive, and stained faintly along one edge with garden soil. Lady Forsyth, who had followed them halfway up the stairs, gasped. "That's mine. My burgundy scarf. I wore it earlier in the day but left it on a chair when the heat rose. How on earth did it end up here?" Hadley's eyes darkened. "Someone used it, likely to cover their face or hands while searching the house, and then left it behind when startled." Lady Forsyth clutched the balustrade for support. but I never go into the old nursery. No one does." Miss Marple touched the scarf delicately. The soil wasn't from the Arboretum's well-kept beds. It was coarser, darker, soil from the hedgerow near the laundry garden. "So our limping intruder came through here after all," Miss Marple murmured, "and left in haste." Blithe paced slowly, eyes narrowed. If someone is hiding something in this house, they might seek a quiet room. A nursery would be perfect. "Unless," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but resonant with certainty, "they have hidden something here for a very long time." Hadley stared at her. Why would they? But Miss Marple had already moved toward the far wall, studying the bookshelf built into the paneling. She ran her fingers along the edges. "Inspector," she said, "do you recall the recess behind the portrait?" Hadley blinked. "Yes, of course. Old houses often have multiple hiding places, especially homes with histories stretching through generations. Secrets aren't stored in only one spot." She tapped the lowest shelf. It gave a faint, hollow sound. Hadley knelt immediately. "Briggs, help me move these books." They pulled several dusty volumes aside. The panel behind them shifted. Hadley pressed once, twice, and the wooden slab swung inward. A small cavity lay behind it. Inside rested a packet of papers bound with an old ribbon. Blithe froze. Miss Marple exhaled gently. "There it is. What the stranger meant to bring you." Hadley lifted the packet with care. Dust puffed into the air, drifting around them like ancient breath. He unfastened the ribbon. Inside were letters, many letters, written in the same hand as the fragments, and beneath them a folded court document stamped with the Greenridge seal. Blithe's voice cracked when he spoke. That should have been destroyed years ago." Hadley read the first line aloud, barely above a whisper. "Statement of Jonathan Forsyth, withheld by order of—" He stopped, stunned. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "It seems, Inspector Blithe," she said gently, "that someone in Heathercombe Manor knew a truth the courts did not, and someone else feared that truth would finally reach you." Hadley straightened, the weight of the revelation settling onto his shoulders. So the motive for murder wasn't revenge, it was prevention. Blithe looked shaken to his core. Miss Marple turned toward the stairs, her voice calm yet edged with quiet certainty. "And the person who feared that truth, Inspector Hadley, is not hiding in the village." She paused. "He is hiding in this house." And below them, faintly, a floorboard creaked. Not upstairs, from beneath the nursery. The creak came again, long, low, unmistakably from the narrow stairway leading to the underfloor storage rooms below the old nursery. Hadley lifted a lantern, its glow stretching thin, quivering shadows along the wall. "Briggs," he barked, "block the rear exit. No one gets out." But Miss Marple was already moving, not hurriedly, not dramatically, simply with the natural certainty of someone who had arrived at the final stitch in an intricate piece of embroidery. "No need to alarm yourself, Inspector," she said, pausing beside the narrow door built into the skirting board. "The person below is not running. He knows every way out of this house and every advantage of darkness. He will wait, thinking himself clever, but he has nowhere left to go." Hadley pushed forward, drawing open the low door with a jerk. Dust swirled as cold air drifted upward. A lantern's weak light flickered in the darkness below. A voice rose from the shadows, calm, steady, and bitterly resigned. "Miss Marple, I wondered when you'd point them to me." Blithe's breath caught. "Mr. Elworthy." The village solicitor emerged slowly, one hand braced against the wall, the other raised not in surrender but in a weary acknowledgement that the game had been lost. His shoe was missing, its pair abandoned in the hedge. The limp was unmistakable now, each step betraying the twisted ankle he had gained while fleeing through the garden. Lady Forsyth gasped. Mr. Elworthy, but he's been our solicitor for 30 years. Surely he—" Miss Marple shook her head with gentle firmness. "I'm afraid the facts have been pointing to him for some time." Hadley stepped forward, voice crisp. "Explain yourself. Why hide? Why run?" Elworthy let out a tight laugh, more pained than mocking. "Because once you found those letters, once you found Jonathan Forsyth's statement, I knew exactly what you'd assume, and you'd be right." Blithe stared, stunned. "The Greenridge case? You tampered with evidence?" "I protected people," Elworthy said sharply. "Good people. People who didn't deserve ruin because of one man's crime." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You protected the wrong person, I fear, or perhaps yourself." A long silence. Then Elworthy sagged, collapsing onto a low wooden stool with the weight of decades pressing him downward. "Jonathan Forsyth discovered it," he whispered, "that the wrong man had been convicted. That the true culprit was someone respected, someone whose downfall would have destroyed this village. Jonathan tried to preserve the truth, but he died before anyone else knew. And you found the statements he left," Miss Marple finished softly. "And you hid them here, in a recess you knew Lady Forsyth never used." Elworthy nodded. "I thought the matter buried, but then this stranger came, Adam Barlow, a clerk from London. He discovered Jonathan's notes in an old estate file I'd overlooked. He wrote to Blithe, planned to hand everything over at the fete." "So you silenced him," Hadley said through clenched teeth. Elworthy's eyes flashed with wounded pride. "I didn't intend to kill him. I only meant to retrieve the packet before he could show it to Blithe. I slipped cyanide into his water flask while he spoke on the lawn. I thought it would look like illness brought on by travel." Miss Marple's eyes were grave with sorrow. "But cyanide is rarely subtle." Elworthy bowed his head. "When he collapsed, I panicked. I tried to retrieve the packet from him, but he must have hidden it inside the house before meeting Blithe. Then your search began, and everything spiraled." "And the limp?" Blithe asked. "A sprain," Elworthy muttered. "I twisted my ankle fleeing the arboretum when I heard voices coming." He glanced at Miss Marple. "You saw the prints easily, didn't you? I knew I was undone then." Miss Marple offered no triumph, only compassion. "Truth always resurfaces when it is most needed. Adam Barlow was brave in his way. He came to correct a wrong, one that you tried to contain out of fear." Elworthy closed his eyes. "I only wanted to protect the village." "And yet," she murmured, "the village would have forgiven the truth far sooner than it will forgive this." Hadley stepped forward. "Mr. Elworthy, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Adam Barlow and the obstruction of justice in the Greenridge case. Stand up." Elworthy rose slowly, defeated, allowing Briggs, now breathless and wide-eyed, to place cuffs on him. Lady Forsyth began to weep softly. Mrs. Bantry comforted her, though her own hands trembled. The vicar whispered a prayer under his breath. The villagers watched with a mixture of heartbreak and horrified fascination. It was never the stranger, they realized. It was someone they saw at church, at market, on the village green. Someone who knew their wills, their debts, their secrets. Such revelations cut deeper than poison. Blithe, pale but composed now, stepped toward Miss Marple as the procession moved downstairs. I owe you everything," he said quietly. "I would never have found him, not like this." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes full of a wisdom far older than the room around them. "No, dear Mr. Blithe, you owe the truth its freedom. I merely noticed what others preferred not to see." "And the case?" he asked. "Can it be righted now?" "Oh, yes," she said softly. "Truth, like ivy, finds its way through the smallest cracks." As Hadley escorted Elworthy out into the night, the villagers followed in subdued silence. The lanterns flickered. The fet bunting fluttered faintly in the wind. The manor, relieved of its terrible burden, seemed to exhale. Miss Marple stood alone by the window, watching as order gradually returned to Heathercombe. She folded her hands neatly. "Human nature," she murmured, "is always the most intricate puzzle." Behind her, the roses swayed gently in the night breeze, their scent drifting through the open window, delicate, persistent, and lingering long after the last murmur faded. A peaceful village once more, until the next secret stirred.